Welcome to the 8 Billion Project, where we're on a mission to make an impact by discovering and sharing the purpose of every person on this planet. I'm your host, Lisa Florida. Enjoy today's episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 8 Billion Podcast. I am your host, Lisa Florida, and today we've got a special guest, Dr. Donald Skip Mondragon. He's a 26-year Army veteran. He spent 30 months in combat zones and is a national wrestling champion. He's a tough guy, yet he became a casualty of depression. When he was recovering from this dark disease, he was called to help other men who are struggling with depression. And in 2020, he released his book, Wrestling with Depression is Not for Wimps. Welcome, Dr. Mondragon, also known as Skip to the 8 Billion Podcast. How are you today?
I am doing fantastic, Liza.
I love your spirit, Dr. Mondragon, and most especially your story. When it came through to the 8 Billion Podcast, I was like, I definitely have to have this gentleman on my podcast because there are, especially with your subject matter, men dealing with depression and, the state of the way the world is today. I can only imagine that there are so many out there, not only men, but women all around. And so you do bring so much, you bring so much experience, life experience, most especially. And so that's what I wanted to share with the audience today. So are you ready to share your story?
Indeed, I am.
Well, Skip, why don't we, and you don't mind if I call you Skip, is that?
No, not at all. Please do. My friends call me Skip. See, it comes in very handy when somebody calls the house and asking for Donald. I realize they don't know me.
Yeah. No, and first of all, I'd like to say thank you so much for your service.
You're very welcome.
That was
It was my pleasure.
26 years of service. My dad is a veteran in the U.S. Navy, and veterans mean so much to me. So when I can ever get a veteran on my show, I always take the opportunity to do that.
You're most welcome. It was an honor.
Well, Skip, would you like to start sharing your story? And from there, I'll go ahead and shoot off some questions.
Sure. Well, let me just give you a little bit of background. I grew up the third of 8 children. My parents were of meager means. My father, unfortunately, came back from the Korean War a broken man, suffered from mental illness, alcoholism, and was in and out of our lives, mostly out. He spent most of his time in and out of Veterans Administration's hospital, the VA hospitals, being treated. And unfortunately, he died when I was 13 years old. So I was raised by my mom and my grandmother, my little grandma, as we called her, my abuelita, as we say in Spanish. So abuelita raised really the 8 of us. My mom went back to school, got into teaching, and then later was remarried to the most wonderful man I was privileged to know, my daddy-o, my stepfather. And that really changed the trajectory of our lives. I was very small, typically the smallest kid in my class growing up, and I was bullied. I was shy. I was awkward. I was physically very awkward. I mean, I failed at any sport I tried, whether it was kickball, softball, basketball, football. I even failed at tetherball.
Tetherball.
But I was a prime target for bullies. At in 8th grade, I discovered wrestling. And it was the first time I ever felt, I think I can do this. And after a few practices, I think I can really do this well. And I went on and had an illustrious high school wrestling career. Finished up my high school career as an honorable mention All-American. Was a mediocre college wrestler for a couple of years, but did well after that. And then at the age of 56, still had the wrestling bug, was sitting up watching the Georgia State finals with my youngest son, Joey. He had finished a very illustrious high school career. We were sitting up watching the finals. And I had a wrestling magazine in front of me, looking at some dates. I think it was May 6th and 7th, something like that. And I said, son, I would like to compete in the Veterans Nationals. If you'll train with me. And so my son at that time was 18 years old. And he goes, okay, Dad, but you'll have to do everything I say. Now, I ask you, what 18-year-old son wouldn't like to tell that to their father? Okay, Dad, but you have to do everything I say.
Yeah, no kidding, huh?
So Joey was my training partner, my manager, and my coach. And we then, about 7 weeks, 8 weeks later, went to Tucson, Arizona, and won a national wrestling championship. But let's move back now. At a much earlier age, I had finished up my undergraduate degree at Oral Roberts University, and that's a story for another time because it started off several years earlier. In fact, I tell people I was on the 8-year plan in terms of my undergraduate career. Started off in 1973 at the University of Notre Dame, left school, confused, trying to figure out, feeling a call on my life from God, very confused, terminated my Army ROTC scholarship. I was out of school for a few years, then transferred in 1978 to Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And it was there that I met my sweetheart.
Mm.
Now, I will say this in terms of my time there. I went to school with no intention of meeting a girl, getting involved with a girl, because I said, girls, who needs them? They take your time, they take your money, and they take your heart. Time, forget it. I got to study and get in medical school. Money, what money? I didn't have any money. And heart, no way. I am not giving my heart away. My heart had just been mended from a relationship I had with a young woman that I'd been in love with. And it took me 3 years to recover from that. So I wasn't about to get involved. I met Sherry my first week at Oral Roberts University, and she ruined my plans.
Yeah.
In May, we celebrated 40 years of marriage.
Congratulations.
Well, thank
See,
you.
those are those serendipitous moments that you do meet someone that really will change your life forever. And now, 40 years later, here you are.
Here we are.
Yeah.
But finished undergrad, went to medical school at Oral Roberts University. Then I was looking, how are we going to afford to get married, afford to pay for medical school, applied for an Army scholarship for medical school. With that and the fellowship that Sherry had for her undergraduate work, we were able to get married. No, it was meager. I mean, we went through medical school on a meager amount, but we
I
got
can
by.
I can imagine. I
But
my sister went to medical school and she did have some friends too that were married also during the time they went to medical school. And it's those sacrifices that you make with each other, but
oh
you come
yes,
out on the other side. It's amazing.
yeah, yes it was. And then we thought we were going to get an Army residency. I get a Dear John letter about 6 weeks before the closing time of interview season and so forth for internships, and I get the Dear John letter from the Army. We are sorry to inform you, but you will have to apply for a civilian internship. And it's like, are you kidding me? Oh my gosh. I hadn't even looked at civilian internships. It just so happened the year that I was graduating from medical school, the Army had so many what we call HPSP students, health profession scholarship program students. Those were those of us on scholarship that were graduating from medical school. They had more scholarship students than they had internship slots available.
Okay.
And so it was a mad scramble. And this time, our lives were, it was a difficult time in our lives. Our oldest son, Adam, had been born. He has a exceedingly rare congenital anemia that there are approximately 50 people or less in the US that have this type of anemia. He was on chronic prednisone, other medical issues that had come with that. So our lives were, it was a difficult time in our lives that at that point. And we get this letter. It's like, oh my gosh. And of course, you didn't have the internet in those days. You're going to the library, pulling out the copies. How do I contact this residency program and apply and make calls and, schedule a flight and on and on. Needless to say, I end up in Canton, Ohio, Northeast Ohio. That's where I did my residency. The program director was new. He happened to be a retired brigadier general, Dr. Andre Ognebine. And I initially was going to go into physical medicine rehabilitation, ended up pursuing internal medicine under the tutelage of Dr. Ognebeen, the most amazing clinician and medical educator I've ever had the privilege of being involved with, who intimidated me to no end, first matter of months. I felt every time he was around, I was like, oh, that's the way I would talk. I was like, oh my gosh, he must think I'm so stupid. But it was really through his encouragement that I pursued internal medicine. And we are good friends and have been for several years now. But
Right.
oh my gosh, did that man intimidate me for a long time?
So let me understand this. So you ended up not, you ended up getting, not going through the Army ROTC to complete like your, what do you call this? Your residency. You had to go
Well,
civilian.
I had to go civilian to
Okay.
complete my residency, and then I came on active duty.
And then you came on active duty.
Right. We
And
owed the
then,
Army then 4 years
and
after
you
that.
served for 26 years.
Correct.
Now, when did you, Dr. Mondragon, when did you start having, like you said, you started experiencing depression?
Okay. You have to fast forward there to summer of 2013. We retired at the end of 2014. So the summer of 2013, I began to experience symptoms. And it started off with insomnia and then what we call negative ruminations, these thoughts like, you have failed. You failed the Army. You failed your family. You failed your department. You failed, and who's going to want to hire you? You know, you're a fake. You don't deserve to be a colonel. These kind of thoughts started rolling over in my mind, and I began to ruminate on some of the difficulties that were going on in my department. I was chief of the Department of Medicine at Eisenhower Army Medical Center in Augusta, Georgia.
Uh-huh. And
And,
Dr. Mondragon, I'm sorry to interrupt. Why could you take us back to why you were probably having those thoughts of ruminating through your head? Was there something that actually happened at retirement or in
well,
your department?
yeah, right. So what was going on? There were a couple things going on. One was with the dialysis unit, and then the other was in the cardiac cath lab. So the dialysis unit, something had happened with the contract that I couldn't have foreseen. It had no ability to change it, but it
Uh-huh.
was going to impact dialysis of patients. Therefore, it would drastically impact patient care, and I was taking personal responsibility for it. Plus, it could impact graduate medical education, teaching residents, visiting residents, and visiting medical students.
Got it.
Likewise, in the cardiac cath lab, because things were so obsolete, there were some equipment that was obsolete. And so our cardiologist had gone to the administration and said, it's not safe to do certain procedures in the cath lab. And that was going to have an even bigger impact on graduate medical education and patient care.
Got
And so
it.
I was taking all of that personally, even though, again, there's nothing I could have done about it. And
And
so,
and prior to that, you had never experienced any form of like depression or all the symptoms you were talking about. Is that
well, I've
correct?
never had it to that degree.
To that
Now,
degree.
in
Okay.
retrospect, later, I look back because somebody asked me on a podcast once. Actually, it was perhaps the first or second podcast I was on back in 2020, in early 2020. Well, have you always suffered from depression?
Mm-hmm.
And nobody had ever asked me that. And I thought, pondered that for a short while. And I said, well, I've always had this low level, what I would call kind of melancholy, but yeah, I've always kind of had this low level that just very low level that runs through my mind. And then when I think back to a few episodes, after I lost the state finals in wrestling as a senior, I was depressed. After, during my freshman year of college, I suffered from depression. When I left the University of Notre Dame, there was another time I was depressed. So I realized, there were some episodes, but it was never to the degree that I experienced that last 18 months I was in the Army. It was there, and it was never to the duration or anywhere near to the extent. But
Got
those
it.
were some spikes when I did suffer depression looking back, plus that just that very low level, that thread that just ran through my life. So
Like beneath the surface.
yes, yes, exactly. And only in retrospect, looking back, did I understand that.
Got it.
So, but those were some of the underlying things, plus the anticipation of retiring. No, here we were. We had been in the Army 25 years. We're looking to
Yeah.
retire, looking to move back to Texas to be closer to kids and grandkids, um, stepping out into the civilian sector. All we had known in our professional lives, apart from residency, had been working in the Army. So a lot of unknowns, selling our home, purchasing a new home, getting a Texas state medical license, a new job, et cetera, et cetera. Uh, Trying to figure out how do we get integrated into a new community. So there were so many new um, new things on the horizon for us that you had that that was coming up on the forefront, and then you had these things going on in the background, likewise. And then in the successive months, I had 3 surgeries in 7 months. And why 3 surgeries in 7 months? Because I had neglected my own care. I was taking care of everybody else, patients, staff, my family, but not taking care of me.
Yeah.
And so here I'm getting ready to retire, and I'm saying, well, I got to get these things done. And with each of those surgeries, it only made my insomnia worse.
Mm.
And then these negative thoughts got worse. And then my mood just got progressively worse. And I then was withdrawing. I just didn't want to be around people. I lost passion for the things that I'm, very passionate about. Wrestling, coaching the boys I would coach, watching wrestling. Uh, that's one of my life's passions.
Yeah.
I had no interest in that. Going out, meeting with friends and stuff. I just, again, didn't want to do that. It was just too emotionally taxing for me. So I became more and more withdrawn. I didn't get out and connect with nature like I normally would. Uh, so you had these things going on. My confidence just waned. Felt guilty. Felt shame. Um, so all these things then progressively got worse as the months went by, and then it culminated in April of 2014, April 17th, 2014. That day started off. My insomnia was, horrible, but got up that morning early. I would get up about 5:15 or so. Uh, Short devotion. After I got dressed, my wife would fix me a nice, healthy breakfast, and after a nice kiss, she'd hand me my lunch bag and my thermos of coffee. Um, I'd pray for her, she'd pray for me, and I was out the door. I like to get to the hospital early. Didn't want to fight the traffic getting on the post, so I was there typically in my office and generally the first person even on the whole floor. Usually there was nobody even else there at work on the whole floor. So I walked to my office and unlocked the door, put my lunch away, turn on the lights. That was, and then unlock the door to my office directly and step in. And then I turned off the lights. I locked the door, turned off my phones. And I then closed the blinds and crawled up under my desk in a fetal position. And for 4 hours, I was asking myself, Skip, what are you doing? Skip, how did you get here? What happened? And I'm thinking to myself, I'm a tough guy. I'm a wrestler. I've been deployed 30 months in combat zones. I'm a colonel. I'm thinking all these thoughts, and then I'm slowly, very slowly began to put these pieces together: the insomnia, the guilt, the shame, the withdrawal, just very, very slowly piece these things together. And finally, after 4 hours, I could see it. Skip, you're depressed. Go get help. And so that day, April 17th, 2014, I went and got help.
You know, Dr. Mondragon, when we first were reaching out with each other, and I read your email about your story. You talk about something called, there's a term for it, emotions without words.
Hmm.
Did you experience that? Were you experiencing that already? Is that what got you to that moment where you had to actually get underneath your desk and try and go through all of that? Or do you feel like that was just kind of something that you had experienced a lot of your life?
At least in part. See, because of the bullying and other things in my life, I had taken on this tough guy persona,
Hmm.
and it had served me well. Uh, they're getting through so many things in my life, so many difficulties in my life. Um, so, and this mentality of a wrestler is we don't give up. You just keep pushing through the pain, and I call it gut it out. That no matter how difficult it is, you just keep pushing through it. Your lungs may just be on fire, and your muscles just ache to no end, and every everything in your being saying quit, just stop. And it's like, no, I'm not giving up. I'm just going to keep pushing through it. And so, as difficult as it was, that was my mentality. I'm going to get through this. I'm just going to keep pushing through this. I didn't have the insight to say, wait a minute, what's going on here? I need help,
Hmm.
and I'm a physician. But it was that
Yeah.
that tough guy mentality that I didn't have that insight to see because of that. And so yes, that in part, would you say, emotions without words? Something of a facet without that. Not being in touch with my emotions, I guess, would have been uh, the term for it. And there's a term that was
Is
coined,
it Alexithymia or
alexithymia, and it was termed
Alexithymia?
by a psychologist back in the late 1990s. And I've been talking about this idea that, hey, men, we our emotions, we stifled them for so long and
Yes,
growing up because we're told, don't be a baby, don't cry, be a man. We're told that from the time we're very
absolutely.
young. And so we stifle these down, and we don't know how to identify them, save for a few emotions like, you know, elation. Yeah, go team. Way to go, guys. Yeah, that's great. Uh, love, at least some facets of love.
Yeah.
And then the other is anger. And those are basically the acceptable emotions that we grow up expressing. But these other emotions, fear, confusion, doubt, rejection, frustration, irritation, so many of these type emotions we don't grow up
Expressing.
learning how to identify or
Hmm.
to express to somebody, this is how I'm feeling.
Yes.
And so we don't know how to identify it, much less how to express that. So how many of these other so-called negative emotions or difficult emotions come out as anger? And it's and so that's what I'm talking about: emotions without words. And yes, that was my experience. And so part of my journey as a man has been learning to identify my emotions and appropriately express my emotions.
No, and that's exactly why I wanted to get you on here, Dr. Skip, is because I know that many men are struggling with that right now. And so I wanted to be able to share your story and have you from even a medical profession, from that standpoint, but even just even your own experience, because that's what really led to you being so purposeful. And this is what you're passionate about, is because in essence, I mean, or if you think about it, it really saved your life, being able to get, identify what those other emotions are that really at the height of it will trigger anger. But with men, yes, you're absolutely taught to suppress your feelings because that's what society excuse me, that's what society had taught you to do, or culturally you were taught to do that.
Sure.
And then women, we express all of our emotions. We
Yes.
have there's yeah, there's not a shortage of emotions for us.
Right.
And
Right.
so even in communication style, when we communicate, either as partners, as friends, as family members, it's so important. For me, it's really personally meaningful for me to be able to put out this podcast, so that many men out there know that this is not anything, you know what I mean? If you have a hard time expressing yourself or identifying certain emotions and being able to communicate, there is, I'm pretty sure everyone's known, there's always been a light at the end of the tunnel. But here, Dr. Mondragon has actually created a book, right? Wrestling with Depression is Not for Wimps. You released that. Congratulations on releasing that book.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can imagine how much heart and soul went into to doing that, and now you're here. You're here on podcast. I know that you want to actually share this message. So, was that really, Skip, that turning point for you, that everything started to turn around after that whole incident underneath the desk, where you finally started getting help? Because for 2014, that was like probably about a 6-year journey. But I mean, here you are now. You released a book and all that kind of stuff. How was recovery for you?
Well, the first year or so it was painful. It was
Yeah.
not easy. Two steps forward, one back, one forward, two back. I remember there were times sitting on the edge of the bed with my sweetheart Sherry, tears rolling down my face and telling her, honey, it's not always going to be like this. Honey, I am going to get better.
Yeah.
It's it's going to be better. I know I'm going to get better, but it was painful. It was difficult. And one of the things that had to happen, I had to retrain my mind. And I tell people I had the A team taking care of me. I had my primary care provider who evaluated me and was involved. I had my clinical psychologist, who Lieutenant Colonel Mike Perry and Mike and I just gelled together, and I was seeing him weekly. And then later, I was seeing a psychiatrist. And so all of these individuals helped take care of me.
Hmm.
And one of the things that Mike especially worked with me with is with a therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy. And literally, what you're trying to do is retrain the brain. Because at this point, my confidence was in the toilet. I felt shame and guilt and just felt horrible. And those negative thoughts, like I said, you're a fake. You don't deserve to be a colonel. You've let your family down. You've let the army down. You've let your department down. Who's going to want to hire you? Yeah,
Right.
those things just battered me day and night. It's like this endless play loop that just rolls over in your mind night and day, just over and over and over again. So Mike was working with me to retrain my brain and help me to see the fallacy in that and to help regain my confidence, my
Yeah.
decision making, this sense, oh, no, that's not true.
Yeah.
Let's look at the evidence. That's not true at all. But when you're depressed, that perception becomes your reality
Yeah.
and it just beats you up. Plus, that blue mood, you feel like you're in this deep, dark pit. And it's not just feeling down, it's like having this palpable cloud that just descends upon
Yeah.
you, sucks the joy and life out of you. So it was all of this, but I had others to help me there. But you were asking about the book, if I may.
Yes.
I
Please
was
share
about
that.
so I was about 6 weeks into my recovery, and I was still struggling. And my brother Chris, my youngest brother, who I call my alter ego, so I have four younger brothers. And Chris called. He's very excited. He had been at a Bible study with Franklin Graham, son of Billy Graham. And Franklin had visited Raleigh, North Carolina, where my brother lives. And he met with a group of men there, and they had a Bible study about suffering, particularly suffering of Christ and Christ on the cross. And the gist of it was, if Christ suffered so horrendously upon that cross for us, why, as Christians, particularly Western Christians, do we think we should be immune from suffering?
Mm-hmm.
And that caught me up short, because for all that time that I was sinking down into that deep pit, and now during my recovery, my prayers had been, Lord, please, please
Mm-hmm.
deliver me from this darkness.
Yeah.
And after Chris shared with me, it brought to my remembrance a verse that I was familiar with in the book of Philippians, chapter 3, verse 10. And Paul writes, "Oh, that I might know him," referring to Christ, "and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings." I was familiar with that verse. I had prayed that verse probably hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times in my walk with Christ. But in
Yeah.
the midst of my suffering, what did I want? Deliverance.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my prayer. But over 2 days, my prayer shifted from, Lord, please, please deliver me from this darkness, to, Lord, what would you have me learn?
Yes.
How might I use it to help others?
Absolutely.
And that was like an epiphany to me, because with that, I understood then that I was going to have to share my message.
Absolutely.
And I began to jot down notes of things I had learned and the things I was learning, with the intention of sharing it. I didn't know exactly when I was going to share, but I knew I was going to share, that I must share it. So before I left the Army, I had the opportunity to share my story and the lessons I learned, to encourage others who were suffering to get help, to help decrease the stigma related to mental illness, and to help those who were suffering with the lessons I learned in their recovery. So I got to share with the hospital staff at Eisenhower Army Medical Center in the hospital auditorium in a morning session and an afternoon session. And then I made 3 public service announcements with the Department of the Army, talking about mental health, suicide prevention, and telling in one longer public service announcements a little bit about my story. And the fact that I was a colonel, well known in the hospital, national wrestling champion, I had all the ribbons and stuff, related to times that I'd spent deployed and doing other things. Gave me a very strong platform from which to speak,
Yeah.
and got up and shared my message. And what I found after I did that, people came up and said, "Thank you for sharing.
Mm-hmm.
I've been there, or I know somebody's been there, or I am there. Thank you for sharing." And the
Yeah.
other thing I remember, there was a former staff member of mine that was on my staff, and we connected by LinkedIn, I believe it was, uh, several months ago. But he mentioned, because I mentioned something about a podcast I had been uh, on LinkedIn, and he commented and he said, "I remember that day you shared," and he said that was the most courageous thing I've ever seen. And so I know it had some impact on people, and the importance of sharing that message to help normalize this discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my signature talks that I talk about is, even tough guys get depressed,
Yeah.
and that to admit you need help doesn't make you a wimp, doesn't make you weak. doesn't make you less than a man. Because I moved in those tough guy circles,
Mm-hmm.
wrestling, soldier, colonel, wartime, if you will, vet. I've been in those situations. I moved in those circles. I'm a gym rat.
Right.
I like getting in the gym. I like throwing around those weights. I like outworking much younger men, when it comes working in the gym or out on the PT field and physical training field and those kind of things. Yeah, or on the wrestling mat, working and outworking others. Yeah, pride myself in that. Yeah, I'm tough. But so that identity there, but to help men realize, no, we all need a hand up from time to time, and it's not weakness if you need help. It's simply being human. It's part of the human experience. And so when you're hurting, when you need help, being willing to admit that is very courageous. And simply going and getting help can be so important. And you owe it to yourself, you owe it to your family, you owe it to your friends if you're struggling to go get help.
Yeah. No, absolutely. These are the stories I absolutely love to share, Skip. And I really thank you so much for being able to have the courage, one, to step forward and recognize the depression that you had. I mean, like you said, with being a medical doctor, an Army Kernel, and national wrestling champion, like all of those things. I mean, what a decorated life you live. But, to be able to step now into this chapter of your life, being of service to others, is the stories that I love to share, because it is. And sometimes, and I say this in other podcasts, it's in those darkest of hours do you truly find your own light inside. And that becomes the turning point for you to change the trajectory of your life. And then it becomes your story that you share with others in hopes that it helps them on their path.
Yes, indeed. My
So
my mess became my message.
that's the first time I heard that, Skip, but I love that. Your mess became your message. And that's exactly what I do. Is I've lived so many different experiences in my life, and I know that there's stories just like yours that need to be shared. But thank you again so much for actually coming on the 8 Billion podcast. Now, Skip, could you please let the audience know if they'd like to actually purchase your book, or if they'd like to learn more about you? Do you have a website or contact information that you can actually put on here? I will put it also in the description box,
Yes.
but if you'd let the audience
You
know.
can most easily buy my book on Amazon.
Okay.
Wrestling Depression is Not for Wimps. And you can contact me at www.wrestlingisnotforwimps.com.
Amazing. So, Dr. Mondragon, thank you so much for sharing your time, your story. And I know you are definitely going to make an impact on the lives of so many men. But thank you so much for being on the 8 Billion podcast. And like I said, if I always let my guests know, if they ever have a message to share, please feel free to contact me. You will always have this platform to share your story.
Thank you, Lisa. It has been delightful. I so appreciate you allowing me to be your guest today.
You're very welcome. Now, thank you, audience, for tuning in to this week's episode of the 8 Billion podcast. And we look forward to having you tune into next week's episode. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If it's moved you in any way, please review and share your thoughts, or text me your thoughts at 949-247-2800.